Hello, my name's Stefan, and welcome back to another episode of Japan at War. With absolutely no defense truly mounted at the Han River, remember that Commander Kim Young-won had actually retreated without fighting, the next obstacle that the Japanese forces would face would be at the Imjin River. After retreating, the commander had received word that he was to gather as many men as he could and make a stand there. He sent out whatever men that he could to tell anyone that would join him to meet him at the river and stop the invaders. Over the next 2 weeks, both soldiers and commanders started to trickle in. Some of the commanders that met his call to arms was Sin Kao, Han Ung-in, Yu Kak-ryang, and General Yi Il, who had lost to Konishi Yukinaga at the Battle of Sangju. The king and his officials at this time was a few hours north in the walled city of Kaesong. On June 11th, under massive political pressure, blamed the crisis on Prime Minister of State Council Yi San-hai. As he was the highest ranking official, the man's position was also forfeited. He was sent to exile, and Yu Song-nyong was promoted to Prime Minister. His position was originally Minister of the Left. Choi Hong-won took his spot, and Yoon Soo-soo would be the Minister of the Right. Politics, am I right? The same day, the King Sanjo made a public appearance and allowed his people to voice their outrage. Paper was also handed out to anyone who wished to write down their grievances. He probably regretted the whole thing, though, as the people immediately started yelling at him, and then fires and looting started after he left from the public eye, which I completely get. After the event, reports came in that some of the businesses in Seoul had actually reopened. And not only that, but they were doing business with the Japanese. Propaganda papers were also gathered for the king to see. The same pieces that said that the Japanese were there to liberate his people. Sanjo was pretty shocked and just couldn't believe that some of his people would actually work with the enemy. Then, while he was reviewing some of these same papers, a man burst in and threw himself at his feet, begging him to reinstate the exiled government minister and Western Party leader, Chong Chao, formerly Minister of the Left. See, he had been excused by the king in 1591 over a disagreement with the king over who his heir should be. Now, though, desperate to make the public at least somewhat happy, reinstated him. So now, Choi Hong-won would be Prime Minister, Yoon Soo-soo, Left Minister, and Yu Hong, Right Minister. And if you had a hard time keeping up with any of this, well, I completely understand. The king, Prince Kwang-hai, and officials continued their journey north on June 13th. They arrived in Pyongyang on the 16th with 3,000 troops as escort, and were finally able to settle in. But there was a real fear now that Korea would cease to exist if the Ming Chinese did not give them aid now. At the beginning of the invasion, much like when there was talks between Korea and Japan, Korea was apprehensive about involving China. Doing so would mean letting Beijing take over the situation. And while Korea was a tributary state, it also still had autonomy, but might not have complete control if they did this. Minister of the Left, Yoon Soo, speculated in a meeting that if the Ming did send aid, that it would probably come from the Ming province of Liaodong, and were what he described as aggressive, undisciplined animals that would probably cause more harm than good. And as such, the first dispatches sent to the Wanli Emperor in China simply told him of the invasion, but not really asking for troops to be sent to help. But the Japanese were almost all the way through their nation. And on top of that, the people seemed like they were starting to actually turn on the government. See, before the invasion had ever started, the civilians weren't really all that happy with the amount of taxes they paid, or with how certain government officials behaved. And now the king had reports of some of his own people working with the enemy. At this rate, his country would cease to even be his. So the decision in court was made to ask China for help, but no reply came back. And then they asked a third, and then a fourth. Meanwhile, in China, the emperor and his court were pretty confused and more than a bit suspicious. Was an invasion actually happening? Or is Korea simply overreacting to a larger than usual Waco pirate raid? Eventually, further reports came in to verify Korea's messages, but then even more confusion plagued the Ming court. What was this Hideyoshi's real intentions? Was he really trying to invade China? I mean, the thought alone seemed crazy. Or was this man simply trying to take Korea, and Korea was simply making all this invasion of China stuff up to coax them into helping repel the Japanese? Or were the Koreans in on it? You see, it seemed really quite unbelievable that the Japanese would be able to advance so quickly without help from the Koreans. The government of Liaodong, which bordered Korea, sent a man to Pyongyang to investigate. Beijing also sent a man there as well. They eventually reported that everything that the Koreans had said was actually true, and trust between the two countries was of course restored. And preparations were made to now lend full military support. But this would take some time. And this wasn't the only concern of Ming China. There was also a rebellion/mutiny in March of that same year in Niaojie, led by a Han officer, Liu Dongyang, and a Mongol named Pu Bai. They captured around 47 fortresses, and they actually demanded autonomy from the Ming, and even threatened themselves to ally themselves with the Ordos Mongols. News of all this would reach Beijing towards the end of April. This would be a rather sizable campaign for the Ming, and would involve tens of thousands of men, thousands upon thousands of horses, and 400 cannons and other artillery pieces. Back in Korea, on June 25th, 2 days before continuing the march towards China, Konishi Yukinaga and So Yoshitoshi sent out this letter to King Sanjo. Toyotomi Hideyoshi does indeed want to attack the Ming through your country, but we, his generals, do not want to go all the way to China. For this reason, we desire peace with your country. so that you will in turn help us make peace with the Ming. If your country advises China to accept our proposal for peace, our three countries can go back to coexistence. All of the generals of Japan feel this way. And this was not the first attempt that these two had made. Earlier, when they had first landed, they had attempted the same tactic, but with no success. But why? Well, mostly it stems from the fact that they were really now in the middle of enemy territory, and also further than either one of them had ever been from Japan, with still a much greater distance still to go. This might have been proven further by the fact that the Koreans actually got their first real victory at land. While the commander Kim Young-won had sent out a message for the surrounding soldiers, one of his deputy commanders, Sen Kak, had actually decided not to follow his orders and instead decided to remain near Seoul and sent a messenger letting him know that he would join up with another commander, but not him. Commander Kim was, furious and sent word of this man's disobedience to the government with a recommendation for punishment. And they agreed. An official was sent to Sen Kak's camp with an order for his execution. Right after that, though, the government received word that he had received a victory against the Japanese at Yangzhou, where he killed 60 soldiers in a surprise attack. The government quickly sent word not to have the man executed. But it was too late. He had already been executed. The battle itself wasn't anything major, but it was a very much needed boost in morale for the Koreans. It was also proof the Japanese could actually be beaten on land. And that's where we'll leave off. Tune in next week as the Japanese go back on the move after almost 2 weeks of rest. See you then.